Welcome to the podcast of the Political Page blog with commentary from an attorney and entrepreneur on the political and social issues of the day, from a rationalist, libertarian, and often irreverent perspective. This is Political Page, and here's what's on my mind today. Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Political Page blog. This one was dated the 19th of August 2019 and it is entitled Eco-Fascism and Slaughter, a Nihilistic Generation Buys the Hype. You know, every mass shooting here, anywhere around the globe, produces several weeks of predictable, mindless hysteria, followed by equally predictable, ever-ratcheting spirals of left-right disdain. And as soon as all that simmers down to the usual state of sullen mistrust and mutual resentment, it's possible to look a bit more deeply into the causes of each given tragedy. And yes, I use the word tragedy advisedly. It is not a tragedy for the killer, it's a vicious murder. It's not an accident, but it is a tragedy for the innocent victims, and more widely, it is a tragedy for a generation that has been raised on apocalyptic hyperbole from adults who should know better, who do know better, and who manipulate them anyway. Let's take for our object examples the mass shootings of Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand, the random innocents in Dayton, and the primarily Hispanic victims in El Paso. And let's go beyond the primal scream hype and see what they truly have in common. And the first thing to recall, the first thing to learn, because basically there has been zero introspective coverage in the stampede to slap on simplistic labels, is that all three killers were left-wing activists. That's correct. Didn't know that, did you? The spin is that this is racism, fascism, alt-right, gun nut violence. And there are elements of each of those things, certainly. But the motivating factor of all three shootings was far more subtle. And you're not going to read it very many places. You got to look. It arises, ironically, exclusively from the radical left and its efforts to hype, to hyperbole, to use dystopian rhetoric to gin up passion. It is inexcusable, and it is literally killing us. Now look, it's axiomatic that it takes two things to convince otherwise sane people, whether individuals or soldiers, to kill another human being. The first is, of course, a cause worth killing for. And the second is ability to see the person that you're targeting as the other, to dehumanize, to differentiate them, to distinguish them from oneself. It underlies every single war in history of our planet, every guerrilla action, every killing, every lone wolf mass shooting that is now monopolizing our headlines. But okay, wait a minute. First, before we get into the philosophy of it, let's look at the facts. The Dayton killer, and I'm not naming them because they don't deserve names, was quite possibly the first Antifa murderer, at least that we know about, right? He was an advocate of the violent methods of the so-called Antifa protesters. And like most Antifa thugs, he labeled anyone who didn't agree with him was a fascist, and he believed that killing fascists was permissible. I want socialism, he wrote. I will not wait for the idiots to come around to understanding. Now, the Christchurch murderer, that's Christchurch, New Zealand. Remember that? He went into a mosque, he shot like 50-something people. He slaughtered them. He was also a left-wing activist. He was obsessed with radical environmental activism. And it doesn't require any research to unearth his reasoning. He wrote it. He was a self-described eco-fascist. He hated immigrants, not because of racism, but because they had high birth rates impacting his environment. Now, the El Paso shooter was right cut out of the same cloth as the Christchurch guy. He was an eco-fascist. You know, one little reported detail, did you know that his manifesto online was actually entitled An Inconvenient Truth, in homage to Al Gore? Bet you didn't see that on CNN, did you? Anyway, he thought that the decimation of the environment was creating a massive burden for future generations. He said that corporations are heading the destruction of our environment by shamelessly overharvesting our resources. And he said if we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can be more sustainable. Oh, evil corporations, the environment, sustainability. You couldn't get more left-wing buzzwords into his manifesto if you literally tried to do it. Now, the Christchurch Manifesto in New Zealand began this way. It's the birth rates. It's the birth rates. It's the birth rates. Hard to miss that, isn't it? The El Paso Manifesto sets out the rest of the dogmata in current 21st century form, railing against corporate greed, fossil fuel exploration, population growth, pollution, capitalism, and extolling the utopian fantasy of extreme green policies. But you know what's really interesting? All of this is happening in the 21st century, but if you want to look back through history, we do still have history, even if we don't teach it in schools. The real root of the modern eco-terrorist movement had its origins, you're not going to believe this, in 1930s Germany. It is indeed fascist, and Nazi fascism was a socialist philosophy. Yes, for those of you who did grow up in the public school system as I did, Hitler's Nazis were actually a socialist party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Surprise! And at the root of Hitler's totalitarian vision is the little reported and often revised reality that Nazi Germany was partially seeded by the green wing of National Socialism. The root of this concept is that the more advanced races, obviously, in their case the Aryans, were responsible stewards of their environment and their fatherland, and that the lesser races, those browner people, the Jews, the defectives, whatever they didn't like, they bred with impunity, and they had threatened the God-given balance between humanity and the earth. They were a danger. They were a pestilence on society and nature. And that is exactly what the manifestos of the El Paso guy and the Christchurch guy say. They are indeed eco-fascists, but they're not on the right. They're actually on the left. Not that it really matters, right? Well, it does matter. You know why it matters? Because what they're reacting to, that idea of this cause worth dying for, is indeed coming from the left. And I have to admit that some of the idea of the migrants being the other is probably coming from the right. It's really a clash of completely different philosophies that is giving rise to a tremendous evil. But wait a minute for a second. The otherness of migrants is easy, right? They have different race, culture, family size, education, wealth. All of it's overtly different. But whether those others are pitied or disdained, the dissimilarity is kind of obvious. And mainstream progressives not only accept that difference, they kind of beatify it. They go too far. It's only the eco-terrorists, the radically green faction within the left, that sees that dissimilarity as an unfortunate difference that is going to mandate destruction for the better good. But let me tell you something, and this is where it gets even scarier. The modern progressive movement is not limiting that perception of otherness to immigrants. There's a second group that is more disdained, more actively hated, and not by the fringe eco-terrorist fanatics within the progressive left, by the entire progressive left. That hatred is universal, and it is therefore more dangerous. The last Democratic candidate for president, Hillary Clinton, described Republicans as a basket of deplorables. The last Democratic president, Barack Obama, openly despised his own citizens as bitter clingers to guns and religion. Pick up any political information online, you're going to find left-wingers frequently referring to anybody who disagrees with them as Trumpanzees, Rethuglicans, teabaggers. Republicans, libertarians, conservatives, anybody, indeed, who violates their politically correct lockstep imperative is a subhuman. It's the reason that Antifa is considered a group of heroes for beating and bloodying, terrifying, and hounding Trump supporters and any Republican politician. It's the reason near lynchings are glossed over by a like-minded media. They are other. They kind of deserve it. Antifa is violent, yes, but literally you can find opinions on this. It's ethical violence. And that brings us to the next commonality between the rise of Nazi violence and the current eco-terrorist left, the perception of an existential crisis that excuses violence. Al Gore started it. He started it with An Inconvenient Truth, the title, by the way, of the El Paso Manifesto, remember? The climate change hysteria that has only grown since. The hysterical threat of imminent human destruction. Despite the failure of every major prediction of climate alarmism over the past 30 years, the disconnect between the theory and reality that would destroy any other scientific hypothesis, it is absolutely believed with dogmatic certainty on the left that we are freaking doomed. And yet, in spite of the failure of each successive failed prediction of disaster, demagogues on the left are going to continue to use horrific prognostications of ecological collapse and mass death and destruction to garner the passions and commitment of their ill-educated followers. Shoot, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez only just recently tweeted to her millennial acolytes that we have 12 years of existence remaining to us. And forget about that steer tactic. The Potsdam Climate Institute tells us we have 18 months from last July. The left-wing hysteria mill think progress says, nope, it's only 14 months. There's actually a word for this. It's called apocalypticism. And there's an environmental professor from UCLA who's studying it, and he's warning that, quote, there's definitely a danger of people taking dire measures when they feel there's no way out. Gee, do you think? here's food for thought. You take couple this perception that your opponents are less than human with the emergency of imminent existential destruction for an entire planet. Now you stir in a little hopelessness for a full generation that was deprived of the social structure of religion, traditional two-parent families, and any societal construct of healthy competition or individual achievement. All those elements of American society have been completely trashed by the progressive left as regressive remnants of cis-male patriarchy. So you no longer have religion, you no longer have the family, you no longer have competition and achievement. You have existential destruction. You have the perception that your opponents are subhuman. Now, on top of that, throw in a good dose of self-hatred, rejection of common biological imperatives, put in a constant barrage of excoriation and guilt for your microaggressions from everything you say or think. Top it off with a constant beratement for being born with attributes for which you have no choice and cannot escape, being white, male, whatever. Sprinkle it with a smidgen of ignorance from an educational system that has been dumbed down to the lowest common denominator and poisoned with revisionist history. And what do you have? You have angry, disenfranchised, hate-filled, self-hating millennial white males willing to kill and die now for a chimerical cause they believe is going to kill them in a decade anyway. And if AOC is correct that only sea sponges would believe the hyperbolic apocalypse baiting that she and her ilk spew into the consciousness of the unformed minds who idolize her, well, we have 3 examples of murderous, mass-shooting sea sponges in Christchurch, Dayton, and El Paso. And the others they target will not always be hapless migrants. It's not going to stop there. Thank you for tuning in to the Political Page podcast today. Original blog articles, complete with a lot more information and great links to original source material, can be found anytime on politicalpage.net. That's political, P-A-I-G-E, .net.